There's not a Shakespeare sonnet or a Beethoven quartet that's easier to like than you or harder to forget. You think that sounds extravagant? I haven't finished yet. I like you more than I would like to have a cigarette. That's Wendy Cope, and it's a very succinct equivocation of attraction to addiction. Her mention of Shakespeare is actually especially appropriate because he regularly portrays compulsive behavior as the essence of attraction. In the first sonnet of all, he accuses his fair youth of generating desire even as he fulfills it, making a famine where abundance lies. And in Antony and Cleopatra, the general's best mate explains to the other Romans that there's no chance of him breaking things off with her for almost identical reasons. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. Other women cloy the appetites they feed, but she makes hungry where most she satisfies. So we have this recurrent pairing, desire and hunger. Neurobiologically, hunger is a drive and desire is an emotion, at one removed from action. But by combining them, desire as hunger, Shakespeare seamlessly mobilizes them both towards satiation, which they achieve by way of the quintessential action of addiction, which is consumption. Eating when you're hungry couldn't be a better example of a short-lived fix for a situation that's obviously going to recur ad infinitum. The comparison to sex is Shakespeare's tongue-in-cheek way of ascribing the same compulsive inevitability to both. If we catapult forward about 2,038 years, and if we hover over a car park in New Mexico, then the idea that you would possibly do anything pleasurable or primal only once is absolutely roasted by Breaking Bad's Jane on her first date with Jesse when he asks her about Georgia O'Keeffe's door. Why would anyone paint a picture of a door over and over again, like dozens of times? Her answer? It's the same subject, but it's different every time. The light was different, her mood was different. She saw something new every time she painted it. Why should we do anything more than once? Should I just smoke this one cigarette? Maybe we should only have sex once if it's the same every time. He looks horrified. Should we just watch one sunset or just live one day? It's new every time. Each time is a different experience. Georgia O'Keeffe didn't love the door quite as much as she loved the flowers, but she painted a lot of paintings of it, and I'll pop a few in the chat in a moment. The door is what made me buy this house, she said. I used to climb over the wall just to look at that door. And once living there, I'm always trying to paint that door because I just never quite get it. It's a curse, the way I feel I must just continually go on with that door. There's compulsion there, but this almost feels more animus, this relationship, with the door aligned with psychedelic journeying, although not the hero's journey model that Rob Anton Wilson takes such a dim view of, which is about bounty hunting for trophy insights. Now, Reanne Crane has spoken in previous talks of her wariness when she sees Huxley's title, The Doors of Perception, being borrowed by clinical research authors, because it's often used as a lone phrase and it's shorn of the contextualization that it has in the essay, with the doors flung open by whatever psychedelic they've administered in the study for a very hero's journey style reveal of the findings. But O'Keeffe's communication with her own door of perception shares deeply with the spirit of Huxley's essay. Their voyages are humbling reconnoiters with that which can only be glimpsed. Whether you succeed or not is irrelevant, she says. There's no such thing. Making your unknown known is the important thing, but always keeping the unknown beyond you. And what she comes out with, the renderings of the same door in snow, sun, orange, and grey, about 20 of them, seem far less relevant in the seeker's experience, which is different every time. I'm just going to try and put this in the chat. I might have to do that afterwards. So it's different every time, just like altered state experiences. It's impossible for a substance to produce its effects without being uniquely ingested in a one-time opportunity by a living being. If I give you a stalk of celery and you ate that, it would be healthy. But if you put it in a blender and tried to shoot it into your veins, now that would not be good. That's some very un-Instagrammable substance administration advice from Purdue's senior medical advisor, J. David Haddocks, quoted in the New Yorker talking about OxyContin, the product that went on to precipitate the opiate crisis in the US, which he insisted at the time of OxyContin was not addictive. When you've got branded substances like OxyContin with intractably destructive reputations, it can be hard to remember that every drug on the planet, regardless of branding, packaging, availability, has zero subjective or psychological effects. No increased heart rate, no euphoria, no dilated pupils, no closed eye visuals, no enhanced pattern recognition, no addictive potential, outside of its opportunity to produce a unique experience in a living being on ingestion. It's just liquid or powder in the pharmacy or in your pocket. Until the interface, where the magic happens. And when we remember this, it starts to seem absurd that drug policy discourse uses language that's so unilaterally faceless, that discusses both substances' effects and addiction in general in such abstract terms. In the mainstream media, people are dehumanized as zombies, junkies, or identified with their substance of choice, heroin user, while policy rhetoric is perversely depersonalized. Budgets, policing initiatives, population statistics, name-check local organizational bodies, treatment phenomena, the passive voice. And even in evidence-based drug safety guides, it's generally the substance that's in center stage. The cocaine wears off after however much time. And where are you? In this propensity for unpopulated abstract writing, bleeds into the public information on addiction too, and is a hangover from when prevention was the UK's primary and sole approach to drug use, which was assumed to be morally wrong, in the words of harm reduction practitioner Russell Newcombe, because it is illegal and or because it's unhealthy. This is an intellectual chicken and egg cul-de-sac in UK drug policy that still remanifests and remanifests all the way into 2023. We're yet to investigate the full extent of the cultural damage that decades spent writing policy and teaching society about addiction with such a negligible cultivation of a sense of personal involvement has wrought. And while we delay on reviving addiction rhetoric and national drug education literature, its wording remains actively designed not to inspire your further inquiry about taking the substance you're reading about, nor to make you look beyond the identikit experience it portrays and think about what you might expect personally, somatically, neurologically, or otherwise. In terms of helping us cultivate a personal understanding of our addictive potential, it is clear that this oversimplified, depersonalized linguistic trip we've been taken on is a trap. The sense of personal irrelevance that typifies our addiction literature must factor into why, for successive years in a row, the UK has had the highest number of drug deaths in Europe. The international network Anyone's Child advocates for drug policy reform with the bereaved families of the thousands of people who've overdosed, unprotected by current policies. Our impersonal, unrelatable education on addiction carries no invitation to explore the subtle interactions of your neurotype and how the ways you've been living promote your habits or deplete your neuropeptides, and your current circumstances and typical somatic responses, and any compulsions or pre-existing trauma you're working through or non-drug addictions you may have already, which, when you start to weave a cloth of awareness that contains all of these threads, can bring you towards a much deeper place of self-knowing when it comes to contextualizing your propensity for addictive potential and where exogenous agents sit within that. Essentially, there's a space between the lines of most general guidance on addiction for much nuanced self-investigation. There are Reddit threads dedicated to ADHD, for instance, where people describe sleeping like a baby on caffeine. And if you're any of the neurotypes prone to dopamine deficiency, you're likely to experience a general sense of well-being from substances that boost it, perhaps instead of the mad rush typified as the neurotypical response to amphetamine that most guides will train all readers to expect. So the more we know about neurotransmitters and our own neurotransmitters, the better we can make personal predictions about where we might be predisposed to drug dependency. Now, this next point should be obvious, but it's really, really not, because this goes against the wording of the general way we language things, which always puts the drug first. Our inclination to take substances is about accessing the altered state that they put us in, and not about the substance itself. This point needs to be made in relation to science writer Zoe Cormier's brilliant book, Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll, The Science of Hedonism and the Hedonism of Science. Humanity's predilection for narcotics, as Cormier discusses, is our embrace, our demand, our need for pleasurable levels of dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and endorphins. It doesn't make for a catchy semantic framework, I'm afraid. When we currently say psilocybin for depression, that's shorthand for temporarily increased entropy of the brain to increase scope for flexible brain activity for depression, which seems like quite a good excuse for staying in a culture which foregrounds the identities of substances over their effects. And in terms of desired effects, consuming substances is simply an activity, as Cormier's book explores, alongside sex and listening to or playing heavy techno, that can get us there. There being not so much a place as a point in our experience at which our brain activity and neurotransmissions correspond to states including ecstasy, happiness, general contentment. Crack is more addictive than cocaine, Cormier, who has a background in biology, explains, because it delivers a more potent burst of dopamine. Of course, portrayals of addiction often embrace ritualistic elements of consumption as part of the addiction itself. It would be an oversimplification of what's going on overall to overlook entirely the pleasure that can be derived from the pilgrimage of practical steps that make up the loading of the pipe. Ricardo flicked a small rock of cocaine from one end of the mirror to the other and chopped it, and bang, onto one shoulder, and flexing his bicep, flipped it back onto the glass like the ringmaster of a flea circus, all the while murmuring to himself. That's from Andres Ricardo's Live Forever, which we talked about in session 10. Hidden in a corner near the pharmacy, buried in a shelf of herbs and vitamins, I find a combination pill slicer and crusher. It is an odd contraption. In one compartment, there is a slot to hold a pill. On the other side is a dome-like thing. It looks kind of like a thick dildo that screws into a receptacle where you can place pills so they get crushed up. This is a wonderful apparatus for me, since it means I can put a whole bunch of Ritalin in it and crush it into a powder all at once, and just spill it out throughout the day and cut it into lines. That's from More Now Again, a memoir of addiction by Elizabeth Wurtzel. Dark clusters of pedestrians formed cloud-like strings. When more powerful lines of speed cut across their casual haste, they clotted up, then trickled on faster, and after a few oscillations resumed their steady rhythm. That's from The Culture of Speed, The Coming of Immediacy by John Tomlinson. But however you do it, consuming, the action you take to satisfy those peskily recurrent experiences of hunger or desire, whether it's with human connection or a chased dragon, is always what Ram Dass in his meditation, Addiction and Attachment, would call a technique, exactly like Zoe Cormier's portrayal of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's the thing that gets you there. A technique, Ram Dass explains, that addresses this idea of birth trauma, that makes us feel good, that gives us an intense moment of relief from the pain of separateness that we experience every moment in life after we're born. A moment of orgasm of surfing, when you're doing something like cooking and you're absorbed in the joy of the process. When what works here, we start to do more of it because it takes away the pain from the separateness, he explains. And taking a substance, whether it's snorted or injected or smoked, it's always the same deployment of this mechanism. It's always an attempt to get home. This ontological return to wholeness has a naturally unlikely parallel with the phenomenon gaining traction in drug policy known as the whole person approach, which understands people as having complex multiple needs into which substance addiction plays, but is not necessarily the main problem. But the tapestry of needs addressed are all around employment, housing, heating, in material realms. And what are our options for becoming spiritually whole in Ram Dass's sense in a society where standardized language underpins our likely belief systems, which tend us towards standardized ways of being and emotionally responding, and which in turn turn us towards standardized coping mechanisms to get through the day, and of course standardized shame around some of those coping mechanisms or techniques, typically the ones that involve illicit services or substances. Whether we realize it or not, it is our woundedness or how we cope with it that dictates much of our behavior, shapes our social habits, and informs our ways of thinking about the world, says Gabor Mate in his latest book, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. He said it. Of course, coping mechanisms work differently for everyone and can change at different points in time and depend on what you're trying to do. But when it comes to writing, even some of the most psychedelic progressive addiction advice is thrown into question. The difference between passion and addiction is that between a divine spark and a flame that incinerates, says Gabor Mate in his much earlier Hungry Ghosts. Addiction is centrifugal. It sucks the energy out of you, creating a vacuum of inertia. A passion energizes you and enriches your relationships. It empowers you and gives strength to others. Passion creates, addiction consumes. First the self, and then the others within its orbit. But this dichotomy is rendered a paradox when it comes to writers on drugs. Opium, Thomas de Quincey wrote to his publisher, has reduced me for the last 6 years to one general discourtesy of utter silence. But this I shall think of with not so much pain if this same opium enables me, as I think it will, to send you an article. Collecting his experiences of its subjective effects was very obviously a necessary precursor to writing what went on to be his seminal Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Charles Bukowski actively portrays his end of smoking and drinking as purely fuel in the tank, but the narrated consumption and how the elements of his nature it stifles flirt with his vices is ineluctably part of his characterization. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I pour whiskey on him and inhale cigarette smoke. I say, stay down. Do you want to mess me up? Do you want to screw up the works? Do you want to blow my book sales in Europe? The only one who appears to agree with Gabor Mate, but just in this comment, is French dramatist Antonin Artaud. It's not opium which makes me work, but its absence. And in order to feel its absence, it must from time to time be present. I'm going on an infatuated tangent now. I did first encounter Artaud when I was doing theatre studies A-levels, so I guess this is a very well-nursed schoolgirl crush. And I compulsively made a mood board because I wanted you to see how stunning he is, but I'll post that at the end. There are two self-portraits in it, one where he's being decapitated and another where he's being shot by a firing squad. He did definitely write in the absences. He produced 26 volumes of collected works in his lifetime, the essays, poems, curses, blessings, spells, plays with characters like A Thunderous Voice, and stage directions like two stars are seen colliding, and from them fall a series of legs of living flesh. He was absolutely anti-psychoanalysis, and he was in and out of asylums a lot of his life, arguably more because people found his ideas dangerous than because he was a danger to himself. Breton said his language glistened like a weapon. Now, his work is indefatigably unstageable, yet trembling with brilliant possibilities, words which have the significance of dreams. When he comments about his use of heroin, it's usually very stoic, and it's always epistolary, to the extent that it seems like addiction wouldn't actually feature in his writing at all if he wasn't fending off other people's interference. We're born corrupted in body and spirit. We are congenitally fucked up. By eliminating opium, one doesn't eliminate the criminal impulse, the propensity to despair, the wailing cretin, nor the progressive crumbling of the instincts. He goes on and on and on in this vein with a brilliant sign-off. We are not quite ready for suicide. In the meantime, fuck off. There's definitely more passion than inertia in his keenness to communicate these ideas to politicians, however. His letter to the makers of drug policy begins with an introductory poem. Here's an extract. Embittered poet, life seethes and life burns, and the sky reabsorbs itself in rain. Your pen scratches at the heart of life. And then he goes for the jugular. Dear legislator of the 1916 bill passed as the July 1917 Drug Act, you are an ass. There is one sickness against which opium is supreme. This sickness is called anguish in its mental, medical, physiological, logical, or pharmaceutical form, what you wish. Anguish, which makes men mad, anguish which damns men, anguish medicine does not know, anguish your doctor cannot hear, anguish which constricts life's umbilical cord. By your iniquitous act, you have placed the right to control my anguish, anguish in me as fine as all the needles of hell's barometers. In the hands of men I have no confidence in whatever, medical asses, dung druggists, malpracticing judges, doctors, midwives, and grandiloquent inspectors. He gets right to the heart here of the contemporary problem that some people in organizational bodies feel the need to categorize and sanction others' pharmacological predilections. He'd take on psychedelic exceptionalism as a topic exceptionally at Harm Reduction International if he was critiquing today. And in terms of the radars we may or may not move under currently, are you taking antidepressants according to your own prescription, or someone else's borrowed meds for another purpose altogether? Who are you getting your oxytocin from? We live in a society which only vilifies some of the techniques that transport us to contentment or release of neurotransmitters that make us feel good, but that does so especially where this involves the unsanctioned use of generally unapproved of substances. Once we're thinking in terms of neurotransmitters, and once we understand ourselves as producing them, what does this do to our relationship with all outside agents, places, people that can affect our inner regulation? It becomes inconceivable to think of addictive substances in separation from everything else that's going on in our tapestry of experience. especially when it comes to love. Rosalind Murphy puts it really poignantly in Overpowered, as science struggles on to try to explain oxytocins flowing ever into my brain. It's a telling misspelling. Oxytocin is in fact a brand name for a synthetic variety of oxytocin, and using it here adds both the invocation of the word toxicity and a sense of chasing the connection's highs while caring not at all about its potential syntheticism. Looking at the overlap between addiction and attachment in more scientific terms, pharmacologists James Burkett and Larry Young pinpoint where it can turn toxic in their paper called The Behavioral, Anatomical and Pharmacological Parallels Between Social Government, Love and Addiction. Depression and the inability to feel pleasure, they ultimately find, are the identical consequences of both substance withdrawal and of a relationship ending or an unwanted separation. In a relationship with a hot-cold pattern of abuse, the body is alternately flooded with neurochemical expressions of reward, love, and punishment, removal of love, says holistic psychologist Nicole LaPera. There's a really great clip that I'll post in the chat where a young Oprah Winfrey goes to visit Maya Angelou and they read books in their pajamas, and Maya dispenses a piece of advice. When someone shows you who they are for the first time, believe them. And Oprah describes having a boyfriend who would never call, and she'd be scared to have a shower or take the bins out in case he'd ring. And she'd spend days sitting at home waiting for him. And Maya Angelou said, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Why do they got to show you 29 times? Why don't people just walk away after the first time? Obviously, it would be nicer if your external stimuli were regularly promoting your oxytocin, dopamine, endorphins, and not cortisol and adrenaline. But just like Wendy Cope says about smoking, whatever you had together in the beginning is easy to like, probably came with narcotic-feeling cocktails of chemicals, and harder to forget. The mental landscape then typically reduces down to the small and fractious psychic circuit, where a chemical bond is created and reinforced with each cycle of torment and breadcrumbing, and you get used to it, to this perpetual Saturn returns. And by the 29th cycle, your nervous system responses are habituated to the conditions of a Narnia where it's always winter but never Christmas. The mental processes are entrenched. Trauma bonding expert Dr. Annalie Alexander is categorical that emancipation from this cycle has to come from recognizing what's going on as addiction and then from conscious pattern interruption. Because it's the kind of circuit from which power easily flows towards what Nicole LaPera would call self-soothing behaviors that in fact mimic the same compulsive circuitry. Substances that quell the anxiety overproduced by the dysregulated nervous system can be appealing, as well as compulsive behaviors conducive to checking out, like endless scrolling, or that complement hypervigilance, like constantly refreshing messages. Addiction by Design author and machine gambler Natasha Schull divulges that our smartphones have been actively modeled to recreate the hit and miss experience of slot machines, which, whether we think we have a taste for gambling or not, is what keeps us coming back. I'd recommend Carl H. Smith on absolutely anything to do with the interface of human behavior and technology, and his talks are on the Breaking Convention YouTube, but to put just a dash of technology into this mix. If you rely heavily on, for example, big tech or social media to promote your business, then your livelihood and your life depend on a dystopian simulacrum whose algorithms influence the levels of dopamine and cortisol in your actual physical body and everyone's around you. And while these invasive psychodynamics are hacking our collective neurotransmissions, the moods of populations are oscillating according to the abundance of scarcity of notifications. And so it starts to seem ludicrous to turn our noses up at any possible magic carpet, chemical or otherwise, that can take us to moments of alternative experience that we can access by stalling these unhealthy kinds of circuits. And what constitutes a meaningful detox anyway, if your surrounding circumstances are neurotoxic? We may have an unbroken brain in the sense that, as Maya Salowitz describes, addiction is not a disease but a developmental disorder, a problem involved in timing and learning. But many of the contexts we're encouraged to put our minds to in these times seem actively designed to have us learn patterns of thought that will lead to distress, to sensations of unwholeness, to broken brains, to the ushering of inclinations towards cognitive shifts. It's something to celebrate within this milestone, though, that many of the psychoactive substances with the least addictive potential and the highest LD50s, psychedelics, can be agents of profound altered state experiences, disrupting calcified thought patterns conducive to other forms of dependency. It was his belief in the potential of LSD, actually, as an adjunct to recovery from alcohol dependency, that got Alcoholics Anonymous co-founder Bill Williams ejected from his organization. But his personal experiences with LSD lent him what he described as a residue of assurance and a feeling of enhanced beauty that seems likely to stay by me. Psychedelic-assisted therapy continues to show promise for treating substance dependency, both because the changes in framing these experiences that are produced can be retained, and because this perpetual shift can underwrite the establishment of different ways of living in its spirit. And scope to address the complex interwoven elements of life that interplayed with the addiction can be addressed in the aftercare and the integration process. Stopping taking the addictive substance should be a bygone milestone in healing. The achievement of thinking and living differently as a result of addressing addiction issues radically needs to become more of a key metric of success, as does praise for becoming open to taking new directions in the first place. As the first Dose documentary chronicles on Ibogaine, sometimes when a person has severe substance dependency, the technique for taking an alternative substance feels uniquely accessible compared to other options. Now, I don't want to leave you with his return to France, to the psychiatric hospital in Rodez, nor do I want to leave you with the resumption of his heroin addiction that followed the loss of the last of his stash of peyote on a mountainside, at which point he needed to be helped back on his horse and became, in his words, like a giant inflamed gum. I do kind of want to leave you with the recent doubt cast by historian Lars Kritak in the Journal of Surrealism in the Americas as to whether he was at Sierra Tarahumara at the right time of year to have experienced a peyote ceremony, or indeed in that part of Mexico at all, and also with Kritak's follow-up delineation of how the rituals described in his peyote dance, which have inspired so many other people's explorations with peyote, in fact have more verisimilitude with the non-psychoactive Tarahumara death rituals. And what, especially if they come mostly from his imagination, I'd like to leave you most of all with, are these lines on the theme of recovery written by Antonin Artaud during a visit to Mexico, which are a conveniently good fit with current cultural narratives around psychedelics and addiction. I took peyote in the mountains of Mexico, and at the time, those 3 days seemed like the happiest days of my life. I had stopped tormenting myself, trying to find a reason for my life. I had stopped having to carry my body around. I realized that I was inventing life, that was my function and my raison d'etre, and I suffered when my imagination failed, and peyote gave it back to me.
Thank you, Roz. So Roz sent me the notes for this talk yesterday, and I sort of sat down to think about a response. What do I have to contribute to this theme, addiction, and was really finding it difficult. So I'd opened Logic on my laptop, the music production software, and then spent about 7 or 8 hours just playing with sound. Really, it was barely even a track that I was putting together, completely at the expense of food, the outdoors, sunshine, human contact, and some tasks and responsibilities that I probably should have done. And it's not like this was a surprise. I knew this would happen as soon as I opened the program. So many of the things that we find ourselves engrossed in seem to look like this other thing that we call addiction. And as I thought about it more, the lines between these categories, addiction, passion, vice, obsession, compulsion, all seemed hazier and hazier. So I went to this karaoke bar to think about it more. I need chaos to think. So I'm sitting there just sort of writing thoughts and notes on paper. And this woman came out of the bathroom and her nose was like covered in white powder. And she asked if she could request a song on the karaoke. And I said, oh no, I'm just writing. This isn't the song list. And she said, oh, I'm sorry to bother you. What are you writing about? And I said, addiction. And she said, well, what I've been taught is that most addiction is what happens when you're replacing something with something else. And she explained, I work at a needle clinic in Seattle, and I have a master's in harm reduction. And she said, a lot of people who come into the clinic, they either don't have a family or they're estranged from their families in one way or another. And it's not so much what they find in the drugs, it's the drug community, the drama and the intensity and the intimacy. And it was only at this moment when I really, really made the connection that you mentioned between addiction and certain types of particularly romantic relationships. And the fact this word addiction goes back to relationality. I always try to follow the etymology when I'm struggling to hazard the cultural boundaries of a particular category. As Raz so eloquently I explained, addiction, it initially had this meaning of attachment and was neutral, and it's the neutrality that's really missing from its current semantic spectrum. It's often the case with curse words as well. If a word has a really strong meaning in one direction, it's often mirrored in the other direction as well with its opposite meaning. They're officially called contronyms or auto-antonyms, so words with opposing, conflicting meaning. So like clip can mean to clip something, can mean to attach or to cut off. Or in Spanish, dar clases can mean both to give a class or to take a class. But anyways, it was really, really surprising to me that I've spent so much time researching and thinking and talking about drugs and language that I hadn't given much thought to this concept of addiction before Roz sort of suggested the topic. And I suspect it's because just the idea of addiction, it brings us so close to ourselves, so close to our shame and our vulnerability. Do I do this thing or that thing a bit too much? Maybe. We worry about justifying ourselves such that it's really easy to overlook the ambiguity of the concept. And also that the word addict, it's so potentially heavy and grave that if someone says, oh, my brother's an addict, it often feels insensitive to say, oh, what do you mean addict? What's he addicted to? Why? It's one of those cases where probably the cultural performance of sensitivity is obstructing a more meaningful cultural understanding of this concept. I've actually never been to an AA or an NA meeting. Of course, that's not the only way of dealing with addiction. But I've heard that these places are places where you're really encouraged not to tiptoe around these concepts. But I'm really, really curious to know what the word addict means in those contexts, because it seems like it changes quite radically from the more casual use. I've heard countless people introduce themselves as addicts, followed by how many years they've been sober. And again, I've always wanted to, but always been too polite to say, what does that label mean to you now? Is it to align oneself with a community? Maybe because the lack of community might have been the void behind the behaviors in the first place. So yeah, I'd love to hear others' thoughts and insights on that,